Hi everyone, welcome back to the 21 and Sensory podcast with me, Emily. On today's episode, we have Sarah O'Brien. She is an autistic writer and engagement professional, currently working within the charity sector. She's known for her witty remarks and commitment to giving those who face disadvantage a voice. Sarah lives and works in London, and in her free time, she can be found reading, crafting, and planning future projects. She is currently writing a post-diagnostic book for Jessica Kingsley publishers, which is super exciting and something I am definitely going to ask her more about. So, Sarah, do you want to say hi?
Hi, yes, I'm Sarah. I am currently, I always forget my age, currently 25, and I've been diagnosed for, 7 years. Something I always also forget as well. Me and numbers do not get along very well.
No worries. So how old, let's jump straight into diagnosis, seeing as you mentioned it. How old were you, because I can't do the maths, how old were you when you had your autism diagnosis?
So really weirdly, I was, not weirdly, I was 18 and I was diagnosed in CAMHS. I was one of those ones where they almost hurry up your diagnosis because they realise you're ageing out. Mm-hmm. So I was actually quite lucky. So I only had to wait a year and a half for my diagnosis because of the kind of whole ageing out thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so were you like inpatient, or were you just being like seen kind of like as an outpatient? So how did that kind of work?
So I was being seen as an outpatient because, as many autistic people know, teenage years are one of the 7 circles of hell. Mm-hmm. And so I was struggling a lot with kind of anxiety and depression. And at that point, my psychologist was like, I think there's something else going on here. Have you heard of autism? And I'm like, no one's mentioned this before, ever. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was the first time it'd kind of come across your radar kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I'd always seen kind of other autistic people, kind of generally that really stereotyped white boy autism and kind of autism media. Mm-hmm. But like back in 2014, there wasn't the same representation that there is now. So I just didn't see myself in this word until I kind of found myself all over Tumblr and the actually autistic hashtags. I was like, these people are exactly like me. How has no one seen this before?
Mm-hmm. And did you do that kind of natural thing of just like looking back on the 18 years that you had, been on the planet and stuff kind of falling into place in terms of seeing autistic traits and things like that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, like, I look back and realised as a child, I said I was allergic to the bright lights of a disco. Like, no one is allergic to lights. Maybe I was just really overwhelmed and no one kind of saw that as weird. They were just like, oh, yeah, she'll just face away from the lights, cover her ears and pretend the disco isn't happening. That's completely normal.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Allergic. That's such a like child way to put it, but it makes total sense.
Yeah.
That's so sweet. So let's have a look and see what else I was going to ask you. So did you have, obviously you've got the autism diagnosis. Do you have if you don't mind me asking, do you have anxiety and depression sort of diagnosed and stuff like that? Is that been a kind of constant for you?
I would say the kind of depression was more of a constant in my teenage years. Mm-hmm. And then anxiety has kind of been the thing that has underwritten my entire life. And then kind of more recently, there's been more physical health diagnoses where it was the same thing of thinking, well, I'm sure everyone else feels like this, and finding out, actually, no, not everyone is overly bendy. Not everyone is overly tired all the time. Not everyone turns a different colour when it gets cold.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. Is that a kind of, when you say bendy, is that kind of EDS kind of sort of thing where you're kind of hypermobile?
So me and my doctor disagree.
Okay.
In the kind of she pushed me into a meltdown and said, well, you're not really communicating what your symptoms are. I think you're just hypermobile. And I'm just like, I'm currently crying and you don't care. You haven't really asked me any of the questions about EDS because you think it's super rare, but I know that for autistic people, EDS is not rare. It's actually fairly common. So yeah, my diagnoses are, according to them, benign hypermobility, which doesn't feel benign when things fall out of place.
I'm sure, yeah.
And Raynaud's and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia.
Okay. That's a lot on your plate all at once.
Yeah,
wow.
it's very like kind of classic autistic person, I find. Like we all seem to kind of collect these diagnoses, which almost feel like badges for how we fight our way through a world that's not made for us.
And it's interesting you say about like EDS and like autism, because there seems to be a lot of like kind of co-morbid stuff like that. Like I've come across and spoken to a lot of people who are autistic who have EDS, and I just didn't realize how much EDS doesn't just affect your joints, but it can be like your digestion and stuff like that, like internal as well as like, you know, just like joints and things like that. So that must be really tricky, especially if you've got the kind of chronic fatigue going on as well. That's a lot to juggle all at once.
You can't see this, but I am nodding a lot to what you're saying.
I mean, just to know that you're, you know, autistic and then have all these other kind of conditions at the same time, like how do you kind of juggle, say, like work and studying, and, you know, if you've got these conditions going on as well, do you have to kind of not plan for things, but do you have like certain routines and things? Like how do you operate daily is my question.
I think it's just a highly honed skill of self-advocacy, which doesn't come naturally in the slightest. It's almost something you have to continually work on and develop and figure out how to do. And there isn't really a rule book of how to be a good self-advocate for yourself. And it's being that self-advocate and being really good at knowing your own internal states, which is not an autistic strength. And being really honest with those around you about what like the day looks like and what the limits might be, and if those limits are different to other days, because I think everyone expects that we'll have the same capacity day to day, but that's, in my opinion, never actually true. Our capacity is so kind of fluctuating and is impacted by so many internal and external factors that often even those that know us really well aren't able to kind of guess how good we'll be at doing something on a specific day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people don't always realise when they see you, you might be, you know, or if you go to the doctors for something, that might be you on a good day. Like they're not seeing you at your worst and having to advocate for yourself in front of like a professional and trying to prove yourself is really difficult.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I mentioned kind of you're studying, you're working. So do you want to kind of explain? So I've had a little look on your website. I stalk everyone before I invite them on. And I can see that you did a BSc in psychology, a master's in clinical psychology, and now you're doing a PhD. Is that right?
Yeah, so I did my undergraduate degree at Reading and then kind of stayed at Reading because my support there was really good and I didn't want to do any change.
Fair.
And then I'm now at King's College London for my PhD, which is in health studies research, and it's kind of built on the stuff I did for work and what I kind of took on as what I thought was a personal kind of interest, but I've realised it's much more like a special interest level of like how much I'm really invested and really interested in what I'm doing in my PhD.
I guess that's good in a way, because does it almost not really feel like work if it's something you're interested in anyway?
Oh, definitely. I think when it feels like it comes that naturally, it doesn't feel as much like work as, say, those tasks that feel extra laborious because you've actually got to switch your brain on to do them. When it's the things that your brain actually gets really happy doing, then it doesn't feel as much like work. But the flip side of that is, I think for like the 2 and a bit years I've been working that I was working for autism charities, my brain never really switched off because my professional work blended into my personal life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that division never existed because whatever I did in my personal life was professional development, and my professional development blended into how I viewed myself personally.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. It's interesting to see the flip side of it, and it's difficult because you don't want to almost get your like lines crossed in terms of not knowing if it's like work or play kind of thing. But
Yeah.
it's interesting that like what made you decide? Do you think like were you just kind of interested in psychology from the start? Like what made you want to kind of go down that avenue of like study?
Oh, I think it was 100% fueled by getting an autism diagnosis.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think because I was so intrigued by the idea of like what autism was and it being seen as abnormal psychology, and I also was in, I would say, a really bad place after getting my diagnosis because
Mm-hmm.
I was taught that like autism was abnormal and it was wrong, and here's all the things that you absolutely suck at, by the way. We watched you for 3 hours and this is what we thought. I wanted to find out more about that and almost kind of use the subject to figure out how people worked, because I've always done that through reading extensively and watching films and TV to try figure out how other people work. And so psychology for me leaned into that interest in other people, but then taking a more scientific view of how other people work.
Mm-hmm.
So it felt like a natural fit, and it was the kind of exact geekery that I really enjoyed. So
Excellent.
that made so that worked really well for like the 3 years of doing the degree, and I got to kind of see how other people spoke about autism, and then found the disability community and started to form some like really positive ways of looking at myself and my diagnosis. And that came at the same point of, while at university, learning all the negative ways that autism was still framed in research. And I was just like, oh shit. Well, I've got to sit through this now. This is going to be really awkward because I know that a lot of these things are wrong. I'm starting to meet more autistic people and realize these are really stigmatizing ways of telling people about autism. And also, we're relying entirely on research that has had no autistic input. So I went through that phase, and then in my master's focused more on autism because there's that flexibility to do so, and found all of the kind of participatory research that was done with autistic people. And I was like, oh, great, we're moving in a good direction. We can actually do this. This is going great. Autistic people can be included in the things about us. And then that just created like this whole career and special interest and then PhD focus for me, because I was like, well, you know what? Research has been bad, but it doesn't have to stay bad. And it can be done with people rather than about people. But that can't be done unless there are people really pushing for it. Oh, wait, I can be one of those people.
I like that you've taken that kind of view of, I'm just going to take it upon myself then, if I can kind of change the future of this. And it's really interesting how you say research being about people rather than with people, and it's really great to see autistic people actually being included in research or being like asked to be like assistant researchers on studies and things like that. I think it's really great to see, because we have that lived experience that you're never going to get if you're neurotypical.
Definitely.
Yeah. So how you said that like your university, you kind of stayed on at Reading because it was like a nice kind of place and they were supportive, and obviously change is horrible as an autistic person. So did you find that like their student support services were good? I'm always like intrigued to hear how like good or bad people's university experience is.
I think for me, like the student support services weren't great, but it was more the things that really kind of tipped it over into being a place I could enjoy was the students' union and my specialist mentor. I mean, like, I knew them for 4 years, and I was able to kind of like really create an environment and a mentor-mentee relationship that worked for me. And so that's something I didn't want to step away from. And also, I'd got really involved in student activism with the Students' Union, and I didn't really want to make those new relationships. And I knew that I was being listened to when I spoke to my Students' Union, and didn't want to chance that not happening somewhere else.
That's fair enough. I totally appreciate that, you know, if you're comfortable somewhere, why not like stay there? And especially if you've like built up all those relationships and stuff, like it's difficult as an autistic person to, you know, build relationships. And then once you've, you know, done that, it's nice to just enjoy them for a bit, especially if you found like a good like mentor and stuff like that. I think that's really important at university, is that you can have like someone to rely on at least. So that's really nice to hear. So let's chat a little bit more about your writing. So I was going to ask you, how did you start out kind of writing on your blog and for like media articles? And also, obviously, I came across you on Twitter. So I really enjoy like how honest your writing is, and like obviously how relatable it is. But kind of what kind of drew you to that kind of online platform and just writing online?
I think for me, Twitter was something I had always used, but I kind of re-emerged on it through student activism and talking to other disabled activists. So that was probably like 2016. And then used it to network with researchers who were doing participatory research in like 2017. And then I guess I kind of like, I felt sure enough in my diagnosis at that point to start to use my voice to describe my experiences, and people kind of liked that. So this is like, it's weird because I've seen Twitter go through like phases. So this is like pre Pete Warmby and Emily Kay. So like, it was a much smaller space being on autistic Twitter. Then you've now got like much bigger voices who are sharing information in really engaging ways. And so, yeah, I kind of like found a bit of autistic community there and met a lot of people who were kind of from, I guess, American autistic communities and the kind of UK autistic communities. And I was doing a lot of writing for my job at the time about explaining autism to kind of different professionals and autistic people, and just really kind of learning from other autistic people about how they were describing their experiences and how it married up with my own, and then just started churning out bits of writing because I'd always been told I was a really bad writer by my English teachers and that I had no capacity for writing in a way that made sense.
Really?
Oh, they were horrible.
What is it with teachers having like, as soon as you grow up, like it sticks with you, doesn't it? Like just the negative energy from teachers, as well as some of the positive stuff, but it's always the negative stuff you remember. Like, how could you say that to a child?
Yeah, and I'd always been told, like, oh, your inferences about stuff are just always wrong. They're always too out of the box. And then years later, there comes an autism diagnosis out of the box.
I see.
So, yeah, I'd been told I couldn't write, which was a bit shitty to hear. But I'd always been told that I could speak really well. And so I just figured, why don't I just write how I speak? Kind of, I don't like writing formally. I like writing in a conversational tone. So why not write like it's a conversation? Which is really easy to do for me through Twitter and blogs because it's that much shorter form style of writing. And I don't know, I like the ability to add the nuance later if needed. So yeah, I just started writing through Twitter and thought maybe I should try doing this in a bit longer form of writing. And so then came the blog and then a couple of kind of media pieces. and then kind of like a toolkit of resources for autistic people. And then suddenly I'm writing a book proposal because I realised that every book that I read after my diagnosis actually made my relationship with autism so much worse, because it was all either written for a parent or for an autistic man, because at that point we didn't really see anything about autistic women.
Mhm.
And so I was never the intended audience of the books that I was reading.
Mm.
Autism wasn't written about in a positive way, and all I could find was like Google searches from hell, where you're just finding the worst terms to define yourself.
Mm.
And then I thought, I don't want this to be what other young people have to put up with.
Yeah.
So I want to take what I've learned in this journey for myself, and what I've tried to do in kind of building that positive autistic identity for other young people, and just write it in a book.
That's so exciting. And so it's a post-diagnostic book, so it's for after people are diagnosed, is that right?
I guess so. So it's kind of like the things that I've always defined autism as is kind of like, you need to understand it first to know what the terms are.
Mm.
And then once you know, kind of, you have the language to describe yourself, you're then able to thrive. So I guess learning how to define autism in a way that's not negative is good for anyone, whether they're diagnosed or not.
Mm.
And then learning how to thrive is also good, whether you're diagnosed or not. So I guess it's slightly less a post-diagnostic support book and here's something to read once you're kind of sure you define as autistic.
Right.
Because diagnosis, as we all know, is kind of incredibly inaccessible to so many autistic people because of waiting lists and kind of private versus NHS or publicly funded diagnosis, and also kind of any additional marginalisation or intersection on top that means you might not get picked up by the clinician that you're seeing.
I mean, even you earlier saying, was it 1.5 years that you waited, and you made that sound short, and that's a long time to wait. But obviously, I know people have, some of the waiting lists are like 3 years or something ridiculous. But it's crazy to think that the way you put it, that actually 1.5 years wasn't that long to wait in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, like when I think about it, it was probably a fair proportion of my life at the time, but seeing now that like for some people it's 5 or 7 years from first kind of like noticing that this might be autism to actually getting a diagnosis, like I got off pretty lightly.
Yeah.
But I think I got off so lightly because no one had ever thought of autism around me. So we didn't have that kind of like long thinking and debating phase. It was kind of straight to referral because I was already being seen by someone. I mean, I was being seen by that psychologist for like 2 years before they were like, oh, maybe it's this.
Oh, really? Gosh. That's so interesting. Like, it's interesting what they do and don't pick up initially, but then even like 2 years down the line as well, you'd think maybe they might have been able to like point you in the right direction or something.
Yeah, you'd hope. But I think given how underfunded and overworked so many mental health services are, they are meant to be the kind of ones picking this up, and like everyone around us is meant to be the ones picking this up, but no one's really got the time to look at us with the depth that we need to kind of get this flagged as early as we need it.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that's why I think especially there's so many like late diagnosed women, is we just kind of go under the radar, and if you're not really seen as an issue and you're muddling along and masking your way through life, people just don't pick up on it, do they?
No, and I think because autism is still viewed as like a clinical difference, it almost has to be having a bad or negative impact on your life, so a clinically significant impact for you to get the diagnosis. And until autism is kind of emancipated from that definition, we're still going to be stuck in the idea that something has to be wrong or kind of atypical with someone for them to receive that diagnosis.
I feel like we could talk about this in so much like depth. It's so frustrating, but I think just the more conversations and the more like, you know, the more people come across this stuff on like Twitter and online, it's really good to change the narrative of what autism is, and that it isn't a look. Which particularly annoys me when people say, "Oh, you don't look autistic," but it's not a look.
Yeah, and I think that also gets into the kind of, is autism a hidden disability? Well, it's not. I mean, I have so many issues with the idea of hidden disabilities, but there's no way that autism is a hidden disability. It's more people have been trained to look for the things that autism, like air quotes, should be, rather than what autism is. And so, like, autism is not a performance. You're not meant to be looking out for us performing our autism. It's in every way that we like think, do, and act and speak. But I think people have been so kind of ignorant to what those kind of autistic behaviours are for so long that they're like, oh, it's invisible because I don't see it, or I only see it when you're in distress. And if your condition is only described when you're in distress, then that's incredibly negative.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't even know how to put it, but yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, like the kind of autism is categorised by our distress behaviours rather than our happy behaviours.
When actually it's a whole lived experience that we can't necessarily manage how we look and feel and act, and it can get on top of you really quickly.
Yeah.
And just coming back to your book briefly, I'm just very intrigued to know, did you sort of pitch the idea to the publishers, or did the publishers come to you? Like, I don't know, book like writing fascinates me, and the process of actually like writing.
So it's a bit of a weird one. So I'd written the proposal initially and sent it off to JKP, and then got into a bit of burnout at work, so was unable to kind of like move it forward. I think that was like 2019. And then in 2020 there was a kind of project being brought together, and I got in contact with one of the editors from JKP and was like, oh, I had this idea for a book, I don't know if it's like still something you guys would want. And she was like, actually, don't be silly, we really want that. And so it was kind of a combination of like, I'd originally pitched it and then was like, oh no, this is a project that will never like, you know, get off the ground because I'm so like terrible at juggling things because I want to say yes to everything. And then it kind of came back around as, don't be silly, like you can do this and we really want to hear from you. Like, chat to me and we'll see if it works, and if it works for you and works for us, then we'll do it.
Okay. That's so interesting. It's so nice to hear that like positive confirmation of like, hell yeah, we want it. Like we can see a like, you know, not like a gap in the market for it, but like it's something that people will benefit from. That's like nice to hear that feedback.
And also it being kind of like, we want to see, like we've seen your Twitter posts and your blog writing and kind of the other things that you've written, and love your tone of voice, which again was just like weird external validation, given that like the external invalidation I'd received previously was just like, no, you can't write, stop that, put down that pen, stop typing on that keyboard, and don't like give your views ever. It kind of flipping from that to actually no, like please, we want your voice, your autistic voice, to help other autistic people create their own autistic voice that isn't negative about themselves, but it's instead that kind of like positive framing on something that has historically been classed as negative.
I'd love for this teacher that said this about you and your writing to see where you are now, see how much studying you've gone through, and the fact that you're writing a book right now, and just I don't know, just be like, look at me.
Oh yeah, like this book will definitely be my like Diana Spencer revenge dress that I will just show to my old school.
Yes, please go and do a talk at your old school. You should, definitely. So talking in schools, you kind of work as an engagement professional, is that right? And you've kind of working in the charity sector at the moment. Do you do that alongside your PhD, or is that something you kind of dip in and out of?
So I started off, so I graduated from university and saw a job at an autism charity to kind of work with autistic young people in what they called their participation team. So it's kind of working with autistic young people who are on specific panels, which are all kind of framed around topics that they would work on. So one was just kind of general campaigning, one was education, one was healthcare, and one was on research. And I was like, well, this is really cool. So it's just, I don't know, it was the nice thing of being an autistic person in that role and almost innately knowing how to work with a group of autistic young people, and the autistic young people being able to see themselves reflected in the staff that were supporting them. And alongside that, I did a bit of kind of policy work. So like the working on the autism strategy and the SEND review and kind of bits and pieces that come up in policy in Parliament to do with autism, mainly around kind of education and health at that point. And that's when I realised I really enjoyed involvement, engagement, participation, and working with communities, and was kind of working with them in different kind of areas for about 2 years, and kind of building up those skills of like going from university where I couldn't do any kind of oral presentations in front of anyone because I was so terrified. And so I did alternative assessments to suddenly like delivering autism training to like 100, 200, 400 people. I was like, yeah, I was just like, oh, I can't talk about this assignment in front of my peers, but I can talk about autism in a funny and engaging way in front of 400 people. How strange. I wonder what the connection is here. So yeah, like making that leap. And then I always kind of kept my interest in research, and then moved to a research charity where I got to do that same kind of involvement facilitation thing and learn a bit more of the kind of nitty-gritty bits of research and how that works. And then finished that in September and started the PhD in October. But I still do a bit of kind of consultancy on the side with kind of NHS and like charity organisations.
Okay, that sounds like a good like mix to be able to still kind of, you know, dip into it whilst doing your PhD. Is your PhD, is it like a 4-year?
Yeah, so
it is 4 years.
I'm like weirdly based in the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing, Midwifery and Palliative Care, and then in that focusing on like the methodologies of research. So because it's looking at inclusive involvement, so how inclusively we can work with people to help design research with them, design healthcare with them, and involve them in decision making about their care and services. So it's still kind of taking that thread from the work I'd done before. It's kind of looking at the how we do that and how that works, which was the bit that I was always so like interested in while doing it, because I don't know, I like to take the debate about it onto a higher level, because there's so many issues with how involvement is currently done, often in exclusionary ways. Sorry, this is like a bit of a special interest. Like,
no, go for it.
Yeah, there's so many issues with like how it's done, and often people have to push through and work in the ways that always seem to happen. So kind of the status quo. Whereas I want to look at the things that we can do to change that, to make it work in ways that are better, because much like any kind of campaigning, the same debates have continued on for decades without any change. And so my PhD is looking at if new ways of doing it can actually make things more inclusive, and how sustainable that inclusion is, because no one really knows, because everyone's too scared to make a change.
Yeah, that's always the case time and time again, isn't it? Is that they're just too scared to make that change. But it'd be so beneficial if and when they do. And it sounds like what you're doing is just such a step in the right direction of actually considering people from all walks of life, which is what, research definitely should be doing.
Yeah, and I think it's the, not to toot my own horn, but having the benefit of having been the person who has involved others through my work in the charity sector and research projects that I've worked on, and also been someone who has been the involved person.
Yeah.
So having that nice, unique little kind of experience of both.
The fact that you've seen it from both sides and can talk from your own experience about, the negative parts of everything you've come into contact with. It's good that you've got that experience and you can kind of build on it.
Yeah.
And we've talked all about kind of autism and obviously your special interest and your PhD and stuff. What do you do in your downtime, if you have any downtime? It sounds like you're a very busy person.
I would say I'm definitely a busy person, being a person that always says yes. So I do my PhD, currently writing my book, and I'm also a carer.
Okay.
So when I do get free time, it's either writing, which weirdly other people say is not a downtime activity, but for me, if I'm able to get words down on a page and that kind of empties out my brain, then that is downtime. And I'm also a very avid cross-stitcher.
Ooh.
But I haven't had the brain capacity for it at the moment, which to me sounds silly because I've always found cross-stitch to be something that is just very methodical. You don't have to think about it. But I always feel like I'm unable to think about it at the moment because I know it's so time-consuming to kind of stitch and get the progress that I'm just I need to do the other things first.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I guess other stuff gets prioritized over something like that. But
yeah,
like you say, it is important to, I don't know, step away from things every so often. But I get that, like you say, with cross stitch, to see progress, you've got to be at it for for a good amount of time. So, do you do you do the ones where you can get almost 10? Is it not templates, but guides of designs, or do you do your own thing?
Oh, I definitely always get the guides.
You get the guides.
Yeah, the kits are where it's at. I don't think I'm creative enough to kind of create my own. I just like to take other people's designs and then create it, because I find there's a lot more safety and certainty in that, and you know exactly how it's going to go. And I think that as a zoning out hobby is perfect, following someone else's rules and paths to get to a conclusion that you already know is going to be there.
Yeah.
It's incredibly satisfactory, and there is no anxiety in that because you're just doing something incredibly repetitive. I don't know, it's almost like stimming, but for a very long time.
That's how I feel about colouring.
Oh yeah.
A colouring book or something like that, because it's a pre-made design. You don't have to think about it, but it's the methodicalness of just the repetition of colouring is so mindful, I think. But
yeah, and
there isn't that, oh, I have to make the thing.
And that must be incredibly relaxing on the flip side of being an illustrator, because you don't have to come up with the idea. It's someone else's idea, and the only kind of real creative outlet you have to do is what colours and what medium of colours do I have to use.
It takes up little brain power, whereas if I'm trying to draw something for social media, I'm I really got to think about this and be in the right mood. Whereas for colouring, you can just sit and do it in front of the TV.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on it's nice to have like arty hobbies as well, I think, like craft based ones.
And I think that's something that's really kind of like, I don't know, almost unexpected of autistic people. Like we've for so long been described as very, I don't know, STEMmy people. So very science focused and like very kind of puzzle focused and like wanting to solve the whole world in our free time by like just thinking of ways to make it better, when really like creative outlets are things that really tap into the autistic brain and that kind of like repetition or kind of soothing nature. And I think thinking again about that kind of idea of it being quite stimmy, because you are just kind of creating something and it flows out of your body and releases all of that kind of built up tension, and is often quite repetitive when it comes to crafting, or at least follows a very kind of rule based way of doing something.
No, I definitely agree. And you mentioned like stimming as well, like it being almost like a form of like not necessarily a hobby, but like a kind of separate like way to just like release stress and stuff. Do you find, are you quite a like stimmy person kind of thing? Are you like a fidget toy person? What sort of kind of way do you sort of exist?
I would say my biggest stim is chewing gum, which
Okay.
has been quite like problematic, particularly because it was like the most socially acceptable stim I've been able to do for like the entirety of my like adolescence and adult life, but is also deeply maligned in schools. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to stick this on a table. I'm just using it to like stim. And I didn't even know that that's what I was doing. And definitely a stim toy person, like always wanting to have something either in my hands or I'm just like playing with my hands, and which is also extra fun being extra bendy. Yeah, I think it for me it's either gum or something in my hands, or just like touching something that feels nice. Like I think that's why I wear the kind of clothes that I wear, because I wear the fabrics that I want to be able to touch and feel. I don't want to wear the fabrics that don't feel nice. I want to, it's like, for me, it's the fabrics aren't a discomfort thing. It's whether I'm able to stim with them thing, which I don't know. I've not seen a lot of that talked about. It's more like, oh, autistic people can't handle labels or buttons or laces or like those sorts of things. It's more for me, I won't wear a fabric unless I can stim with it. And fortunately, uncomfortable fabrics I can't stim with.
That's really interesting, like the way you said that, because to me, like clothing's a really like sensory thing, and like you just said, that's kind of how it's usually perceived as, you know, we can't tolerate this or we like seek out that. But actually you're saying it from the point of view that it's something that's like comforting to you and something that, you know, might kind of ground you if you can, you know, stim with it. It's a really interesting like other way to look at it.
Yeah, I would definitely say for me is the kind of like stimming potential is bigger than the sensory potential, but like the sensory feeds into the stimming and the stimming feeds into the sensory sort of thing.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Like the crossover between things.
And like not being able, but not knowing these things until someone else says it, and then you're like, oh wait, no, this could be a thing. I can't believe someone's been in my brain and like figured out this word or way of talking about something that I've never had before.
And especially on like sites like Twitter and Instagram, you like see like other people's coping mechanisms and things, and you think, oh, that's why I do that. Or you see it and you think, oh, I could try that. Like it gives you almost like ideas and like different ways of looking at things, even if you are like autistic yourself.
Yeah, and I think that connection to a community, it is kind of like a double-edged sword of why doesn't this community exist in my real life? Not my real life, my like in-person life. And also it can be either a really welcoming community or one that can turn on you really quickly.
Yeah.
So you can get a lot of solidarity and support and friendship from the autistic community online, but there's almost, at least for people who are new to it, so many idiosyncratic rules and like things that don't seem to make sense, like ways you have to talk about autism and things we will all instantly jump on, and people deciding to die on every single hill and calling everything out. And it can be exhausting feeling like you have to do that as well, and kind of stand alongside every person and call out every single thing that is wrong with how others talk about autism and how like the community works together. But I think we can just kind of like take the bits of the community that we want to, talk about the things that we want to, reach out to those that we want to, and not have to engage with everything, because like it's incredibly overwhelming to think about engaging with every single thing that's going on in the autistic community, and can also be very triggering.
Yeah, it's really interesting, just the way you've put that. And I think I was talking to Pete Warmby, who you mentioned earlier, in a previous podcast episode, and he was saying that what I was asking him, I was like, do you know what it's like to feel like he almost felt like this responsibility as someone who had all these followers to, you know, get things right all the time. And it's really difficult because with a following, it's really quite scary to, you know, potentially say something slightly wrong and have to backtrack.
Yeah, because like if I think back to what I think it was like 3 years ago now, I had 4,000 less followers than what I currently have. And you can go from like just almost talking to yourself on the internet, and that's how it feels, to suddenly you are held accountable for every word you say. And if it doesn't align perfectly with every single person's experience or view, then it almost becomes open season on you. And that's just like not fair for anyone, because why would we expect someone to change who they are when they gain more people who want to listen to them? Because if they were authentic as themselves with a smaller following, do they then have to become an inauthentic version of themselves with a larger following?
Yeah.
And it puts, as you said, so much pressure on people to be right all the time, to reflect all of these experiences all the time. And sometimes you just want to like talk about how shitty your day was and not have someone go, well, that wasn't my day. Yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult and incredibly demanding to be an autistic person online, because you're almost not allowed to exist as an autistic person. You have to exist as an autistic advocate. And that is not appropriate to demand of everyone.
And do you find it like difficult? Because I guess, like you say, sometimes you just want to like talk about how shitty your day was. Like, do you find it hard because obviously like your Twitter is like a professional kind of outlet as well? Like it's a way that you connect with other like, you know, academics or researchers and things like that. And do you sometimes just want to be yourself and not almost have those people watching?
I think it's a realization I came to, like, unfortunately, probably too late, that as I said earlier, the kind of my professionalism is blended so tightly with my like personal self that I can't segregate the two. And so it's something I've never actually tried to do, because if I was to kind of conceal these parts of myself and attempt to appear more professional, then that would be me being inauthentic. And it would almost be kind of a type of, I guess, digital masking where I'm lying about the reality of my experience. And I think the honesty is so much more useful. So I've always made the, I guess, unconscious decision, subconscious, it feels like it's not unconscious because I'm definitely awake while making it.
Yeah.
The decision that like my Twitter, which started off as personal, then dipped into professional, will always remain that kind of quasi semi personal professional blend, because there's no other way for me to be.
Yeah.
And also, like, I guess the breakdown of like my Twitter is a weird mix of like academics who follow me for whatever reason of being an autistic person online, autistic people who follow me because I chat about autism, and then a whole bunch of like people who work in healthcare from the time that I was like doing healthcare related work, and then also just people who like work in the sector that I work in. So because that all of that is informed by every part of me, taking away parts of me doesn't work for that. And I know that that's not sustainable for other people or appropriate for other people, but it's just what seems to work for me.
And also, I'd like to think that, you know, from the flip side of what I was saying, you know, like worrying about professionals and stuff like that, actually, if they are autism researchers or academics and stuff like that, they should be very open and not interested as such, but they should be very welcoming of the fact that you're being your authentic self, and should be not learning from you, but, you know, being able to just see your experience online and take you for who you are is really important. And like you say, you're this kind of blended kind of professional, but also you are an autistic person at the end of the day. They should what I'm trying to say is they should appreciate your your views as someone who's a bit of both.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the idea of it that I came to. I mean, it was like the idea of it that I came to with like a tiny bit of therapy, where I was like, "Cool, this feels too personal to be professional, and professional to be personal."
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely kind of. It took a long time to get to that level of comfort, but I think I still do share content as if I'm just talking to myself and kind of creating almost like a diary of things I'd want to remember and kind of note down for the future. And then it just turns out that people interact with that. And I think for me, that is my authenticity. And that's how I was able to kind of like reconcile the being overly sincere on main type vibe that I just have.
And where can, I feel like we keep mentioning your social media, where can people actually follow you? We should really mention your social media handles, and I'll put them in the show notes as well.
So Twitter, I am at Sarah Marie OB. It's very inventive, I know. And then on Instagram, I don't do as much over there because I get scared by the idea of sharing pictures rather than words, which is ironic. Fair. Given that I always thought I was terrible at words. I'm just at Sarah Marie O'Brien.
Okay, fab. I'll pop those both below, and maybe I'll put your website below as well, because that's where I found out some more information on you. So,
oh yes, a website that definitely needs updating.
That's the only thing about, like, I've got like a portfolio website as well. It's so much effort, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
And every time you do something, you're like, I should really put that on my website.
I was just like, I don't want to be held accountable to a little webpage of myself.
I know. It's difficult, isn't it? Like, it's almost like a living CV. And it's like, are people checking this? Because I should really update it.
Yeah.
I'm glad you feel the same. Well, we've been almost chatting for an hour, which has gone very quickly. And I feel that there's much more we could talk about. But yeah, thank you so much for being up for coming on the podcast. And good luck with the book. It's super exciting. Do you know, I think you said it was out like 2023, is that right?
It's coming out in spring 2023, I think, from talking to my editor. But yeah, I've like got 64,000 words that I just need to like figure out how to make them the final ones.
That's the word like count, is it?
Word count at the moment. So I think they're allowing me to go up to like 75,000 if I need to. Because she was like, I like your writing style. It's padded, but in a good way, because it just makes sense for you to use the amount of words to say the things you want to say.
Okay, that's nice to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got like a nice word count to play with. That's good to hear. Well, we'll make sure you go and follow Sarah, everyone, if you want to stay up to date with like how her book is going, because I know you kind of like tweet like every so often about how it's going and like the manuscript and stuff. So yeah, make sure to go follow her. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
No worries.